Monty Burke is the New York Times best-selling author of Saban, a biography of Nick Saban, Lords of the Fly, Rivers Always Reach the Sea, Fourth and Goal, and Sow Belly. His books have won numerous accolades, including an Axiom Award for biography and Best Book of the Year by Sports Illustrated, Outdoor Life, Field and Stream, and Amazon. After a 14-year stint as a reporter and editor at Forbes magazine, he's now a contributing editor there, as well as at Garden and Gun and The Drake. Garden and Gun sounds kind of interesting. You can connect with him on social media via Monte Burke 13 or through monteburke.com. His latest effort is called Men of Troy, and it is I think, the definitive biography of Pete Carroll. It's from Grand Central Publishing, released this past January 13th. It's, a period, the Pete Carroll era at USC went from 2001 to 2009, featured a remarkable 3 Heisman Trophy winners in a 4-year span, something that's never happened in Heisman history. Monty talked to over 150 people for the book. At full disclosure, I was one of them. He spent a lot of time with Pete Carroll. He was one of our great coaches, and he's on the Heisman Trophy podcast to talk all about it. Welcome, Monty.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So what drew you to doing this biography? What really made you think I want to tell a story about Pete Carroll?
Well, I mean, it was that particular part of Pete Carroll's life our coaching life was so interesting to me. I mean, I kind of think it was a singular era, right? I mean, you got this guy. Carroll came into coaching with a very unconventional kind of philosophy and background. I mean, he grew up in the summer of love in the Bay Area, and he studied, psychology and Far Eastern mysticism. And, he was very much a player's coach, which back then particularly was a pejorative term.
Mm-hmm.
And, it hadn't worked for him in the NFL. He'd had 2 head coaching jobs, gotten fired by the Jets, fired by the Patriots, and actually spent a year out of football. So USC, was kind of equally downtrodden at that time. It hadn't really been nationally relevant for like 2 decades leading up to his hiring. And he was either the 3rd or the 4th choice, depending on who you talk to there at USC. And, I just found it really interesting. I mean, here he came to this place that was so desperate to win, and as desperate as he was, really. He had these younger guys that, more impressionable probably than pros, certainly more captive back then. I mean, they had to be there for 3 or 4 years, not like now. And it was a great proving ground to see whether his philosophy worked. I mean, his philosophy is very different from Nick Saban's and Bill Belichick's. He was the good cop. He was the player's coach. And then, I think if you just look at the era, kind of, it's such a nice contained 9 years. It's so interesting because you have the build with Palmer and Polamalu, and then you got the 2 championships in a row, and then you have that great game USC Texas, which is still the most watched national title game ever. And USC comes within about 6 inches of Lendell White. If you could just have fallen forward a little further, they would have won 3 in a row, an unprecedented 3 in a row. And then you had this kind of weird sort of slight failures in 2006, 2007, 2008. And then it all comes crashing down in 2009. And of course you have the scandal at the end. Yeah. So it had a nice kind of narrative arc. And then you throw in there the fact that, there were no NFL teams in LA at the time. And, they started to win, and boy, do celebrities love winners. And so all of a sudden you had, the Fonz and Arnold and Snoop Dogg and Will Ferrell, like not just at games. I mean, those guys were going to practices, and it became this huge vibe kind of that Carroll created there, and was a great, great, great strength. In the end, I think it could have turned out to be, their Achilles heel as well, which we can get into. But anyway, so to me, it was this incredibly cool, contained era that lasted, just as long as the actual Trojan War.
Yeah.
Trojan War. So that again, kind of as a geek, like a reading geek, I was kind of like, ooh, that's kind of cool. So
right.
I don't know. It was a singular thing it'll never happen again. It never happened before. I don't think it'll ever happen again. So it felt like a cool thing to document.
Yeah, that's you look at the record, 97-18 overall, 82-8 during that specifically dominant 7-year period from 02 to 08. Like you mentioned, it was like a bell curve in a bit. You had the 2 outlier seasons, the first one at 6-6, the last one at 9-4. Pete Carroll and USC dominated the first decade of the 21st century, just like Alabama dominated the second decade. FSU and Nebraska dominated the 90s. Miami really dominated the 80s. Kind of a few teams in the 70s. Given all that, I mean, you go look back at the great coaches of the 70s, like Barry Switzer, Bear Bryant, in the 80s with Bobby Bowden, Tom Osborne, and Nick Saban after Pete Carroll. But I don't think that for some reason people don't talk about Pete Carroll when it comes to one of the great all-time coaches. He's not one of the first names off the lips of people on either on whether you talk about football as a whole, because he also won a Super Bowl, almost won a second. Like you said, he dominated a decade, which in a way that no one's ever done, and then he won a Super Bowl. But somehow he's not really doesn't seem to be on the short list.
Yeah,
Why do you think that is?
I agree with you. I mean, it is funny too because he probably should be. I mean, he had the historical accident of being around at the same time as the guy who's considered to be the greatest college coach of all time, which is Nick Saban, and the
Mhm.
guy who happens to be considered the best NFL coach of all time, Bill Belichick, right? And they all
Yeah.
left. I mean, Pete didn't end up retiring, and Belichick didn't either, but they all left, their teams at the same time, basically. So
Mhm.
he got lost in the wash there, right? I mean, it was like everybody was talking about Belichick and Saban, especially because they were connected, back in earlier in their careers. But also, I think it has something to do with the way he did it. Just this kind of like, rah rah, player first. Towards the end of his tenure there at USC, he started, there was some psychobabble coming out of his mouth. He was very much West Coast kind of like, Boston writers, New York writers used to love him, call him flakies, what they called him. But I also think, it's split too, right? So he's at USC and then he goes to the Seahawks and it does extremely well there too. So if you take those two things together, it's a pretty remarkable resume. He's only one of three coaches to win a national title and a Super Bowl. He came within 6 inches of having 3 titles in a row at the college level, and then he came within one terrible decision at a goal line of having 2 Super Bowls in a row. So, I mean, he was like this close to being maybe in the GOAT conversation. But I think he's
Yeah, he
certainly
was almost.
top 12,
Yeah.
top 10, I don't know, top
Yeah.
15.
He,
He's up there.
he was he could have been Saban before Saban. A few things go right at USC,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. I mean, and just kept it. He kind of laid a blueprint for Saban. I talk about that in the book a little bit. I mean, Saban kind of locked down his area in the South, and then he started poaching guys. Minka Fitzpatrick from New Jersey, and
Mm.
guy Bryce Young from California. He just started getting like superstars, and Saban or Carroll had already done that. Mike Williams, Brian Cushing. You think of all these guys who weren't. He locked down LA in particular, but also California. But
Yeah.
then he started going, with the help of Lane Kiffin and his great assistants who were great recruiters and getting great guys out of Florida and great guys out of, wherever, New Jersey, wherever. So it's kind of funny. That was the blueprint that Saban, kind of followed.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, before we get into some more details about Pete Carroll's time at USC, and since we're on this topic, why did Saban succeed to become Nick Saban, the Nick Saban of college football? This how many titles was it? Has it been 6? Was it 6 at Alabama? And
On LSU. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So, but Pete could have won 3, 4, maybe even 5 titles at USC very, very plausibly. What was the difference? Like, what did Nick Saban do differently, or what situation was different? Do you think that, or was he just that? Is he just that much better of a coach? Was he that more disciplined?
Just, I
What do you
think
think?
discipline has something to do with it, and just relentless drive to do this. And like, he had a 24-hour rule, right? Whether you lost or you won a national championship, you had 24 hours to celebrate it, and then on to the next season. And what Carroll to me seemed to get, like, he was fidgety a little bit. He was always kind of, moving, and he was always wanting to do something a little bit different. And he had that kind of curiosity about life and about psychology and about, like I said, Far Eastern mysticism. So I think he kind of wanted to reinvent himself a number of times, right? I mean, he wanted to sort of,
Yeah.
he got like, I don't even remember Tiger during his, and not to compare Tiger Woods to Pete Carroll, but Tiger got bored at certain points during his, prime, and he would just redo his swing, for kind of no other reason than just to challenge himself. So I think there was also probably a little ego. You and I talked about this in the book, actually. There's a little ego involved in there too. Like, he wanted to do it. He started these great assistants, Ed Orgeron and Norm Chow, started leaving the program because Pete kind of wanted to see if he could do it himself. And as it turned out, that was a little bit harder without those great guys. So, I think it's a combination of a bunch of things, but a lot of it has to do with just this sort of wanting to keep like raising the bar a little bit and just like getting bored almost, right? I mean, it was like, I just want to make it a little bit harder somehow,
Yeah. Uh, the 3 Heisman winners, Carson Palmer, Matt Leinart, Reggie Bush. Of course, Leinart and Bush were back to back. Jason White won in 2003, sandwiched in between Palmer and Leinart. Palmer was really the guy that got the thing started. Yet he was a Hackett recruit, and he was a bit of a reclamation product. And it's actually funny. An old scouting friend of mine once said that you'll never see someone of that talent be like a fifth year senior again, perhaps Carson
Yeah.
Palmer, but it was a bit of a fluke. And Pete Carroll, and he broke his collarbone third game of his true sophomore season, redshirted, and this enabled him to play 2 years with Pete Carroll and Norm Chow. Was it really just a matter of having that little bit of luck, the ball bounce his way, so to speak, to really get things started so that it could all work? Is this just all a game of, is this all counterfactual stuff that you get into?
I think there's a lot of validity to it. I mean, there was he also had, he had trouble with Hackett and Hugh Jackson, his offensive coordinator back then. And I mean, the play, apparently the Hackett's playbook was like the size of like 4 War and Pieces, right? And Chow just shrunk it. And Chow doesn't probably get enough credit. He been the quarterback's coach and the offensive coordinator at BYU, and developed Jim McMahon, Steve Young, Ty Detmer, Robbie Bosco, been there when they won the title, when BYU won the title, and just was a kind of a quarterback whisperer, right? I mean, he just really just knew how to get the best out of these guys. And Carson was an incredible athlete. Everybody you talk to on that team who was there with, Palmer and Leinart will all say that Palmer was just like, the best quarterback ever.
He was phenomenal.
I mean, I think Chow actually said if you could do a video of like what a perfect quarterback looks like, you just do 5 minutes of Carson Palmer. So I think that, being able to be there for 2 years with Chow and under Carroll, and Carroll recruited extremely well. The Hackett guys were like ready to win, right? So they were really motivated. And then Carroll and his staff recruited so well and filled in some of the blanks. And so I just think that it was great for him. And it's a bummer that these days that these guys, I mean, look at Ty Simpson is a great example. Like that, he has a lot of the tools, maybe all of the tools, but another season would probably help. It's funny because Sanchez actually later be sort of the first guy to kind of like do one season and say like, I'm ready, so it really benefited Carson Palmer to be there for sure.
It strikes me when you measure it from the 5-7 last year of Hackett, year 2000, and then 2 years later, by the end of the season, last 9-8 games of the season, USC is arguably the best team in the country, and then they win 2 national championships. And he walked into LA with some guys and Carson Palmer and Troy Polamalu and a commitment from Matt Leinart, who had already committed, I think, to Paul Hackett. And he just, got him to reaffirm. And it makes me think about like Indiana, right? So they didn't have a bunch of guys, and they brought in some guys, and a couple of the guys developed. And and I guess what I'm trying to say is maybe you're not that far from competing for a national title as you think you are, or maybe some schools aren't. Like maybe a school like USC isn't always that far from being able to do it. Was that a factor too, in the fact that it was USC, and that could Pete Carroll have done it anywhere else? I guess is maybe what I'm asking.
Great question. He tried to get the job, which would have been fascinating. During that year off between after getting fired by the Patriots before he got hired by USC, he applied for the UNC job, which went to this guy who had like 4 losing seasons basically. So it would have been interesting. Again, I think being out west was huge for Pete. Being in the more free thinking, the Northeast is still kind of puritanical. It really is. Like, people are very, kind of hardcore about, things, the press, the media in particular. So, it's a great question. But, one thing about those USC teams is that Hackett actually recruited pretty well. And maybe that was because USC, USC still had the name and the helmet and, it had the whole deal, right? So he had, to get Polamalu and to get Carson Palmer, he had some really good pieces on that team. But so, it's interesting. Team building to me is a total mystery to me now. It seems like if you've got a big donor, that's the most important thing these days, to have a Mark Cuban on your side really helps.
So, Carson Palmer comes in, develops, wins the Heisman Trophy. What did Pete say about that 2002 season, Carson winning? Like, how did that change the equation about what he can do? What did he start to realize about USC?
Yeah, I think that was the sort of catalyst for all of it, right? That was when, like you said, by the end of that Carson's last year, they were the best team in the nation. They really were. And, Carson had this kind of wistful speech at the end of the Orange Bowl where he was like, man, I'm jealous of you guys who are still here because you're going to win national. He actually said you're going to win national championships. He could not have been more right, obviously. So, I think, it brought attention to what was going on out there. I mean, all of a sudden they kind of came, they had not a great season, 2001 was not a great season, and so they kind of all of a sudden just brought this kind of attention to it. And I remember there was a great O.J. Simpson showed up at a practice.
I remember that.
Orange Bowl. Yeah, you might
speaking of Heisman winners.
Exactly. So he shows up and it's this it's kind of this embarrassing thing, right? He's already been through the whole trial and all that sort of stuff like that. And they actually handle it fairly well, as well as they could. OJ, talks a big game when he's with the team or whatever. But I remember talking to one of the players there and, he was like, yeah, it was really odd that OJ was there, but it meant that we had made it. Like we were big enough time for people like OJ to come and, and they really had,
he was like the most famous person on earth at the time.
Yeah, he was. So all of a sudden you had this team that was like, whoa, like, West Coast team, like what's going on? This isn't SEC. This isn't like, Oklahoma. This isn't Penn State. I mean, here's USC might be back, and they were. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. I was actually at that practice. I was looking one way and turned around and I see OJ's hand in front of me offering it. And out of reflex, I said, hey, how you doing? And I remember I was driving with Pete and my boss, Tim Tessalone, in the car back on the way to the hotel. Pete's like, so how do you think it's going to play? We had a lot of phone calls at Sports Information at USC for a few days after. So that was fun. I remember it really did seem after that Orange Bowl win against Iowa in 2002, the parties afterwards, there really did seem to be this level of exuberance and just kind of, I don't know, it felt like maybe the players on the team felt they had mastered the college game, or they were on their way to mastering and on their way to figuring it out because they really seemed to dominate a lot of teams as the Pete Carroll era went on.
Yeah. I mean, 34 wins in a row. Will we ever see that again? Is a great question, right? I mean, that stat alone blows my mind, actually. I mean,
you don't need to win 34 games in a row anymore. Right?
But back then you did. There was such a fine line, right? If you lost once, and in 2008, that 2008 USC team lost once, and they didn't come close. They didn't come close to getting to the national title game when they were probably the best team in the country. So, yeah, I mean, I think that after that there was this confidence that came from not just the players, but the coaches too. I mean, they things were humming, and then they, the one thing going into the next season was who's going to be the quarterback. That was the big thing, and it wasn't clear actually. Matt Castle had a really good chance. In fact, they thought Castle was probably going to be the one, and they had another guy named Brandon Haynes or something like that.
Brandon Hance, yeah,
Hance, who was like he was kind of the scrambling guy.
Yeah, he was a Purdue transfer. He had kind of a bad shoulder, I think. So
he actually had been in the lead. He had either had a bad shoulder, or he had some kind of meningitis or some kind of sickness or something like that. Out of practice. And Leinart was like, not necessarily the number one guy. And it came down to the very last, among the last practice. And Chow was like, this is our guy. This is our guy. He was very different from Palmer. He wasn't this big imposing guy. He didn't, he was tall or whatever, but he wasn't kind of like this prototypical quarterback looking guy. He was a lefty. Didn't throw it as hard, had beautiful ball placement, turned out to be a great leader, but you don't really know that until you put the guy in the game. Then, of course, he goes to his games down in 80-degree Auburn, where the defensive linemen in Auburn are licking their chops. They can't wait to get at this guy. And he plays really well. First pass ever is a touchdown. So,
Yeah, he was a gamer, right? I remember those that spring competition. He didn't really seem to separate himself from the other guys. I mean, it was very, fine hair difference between him and Castle. And they also brought in J.D. Booty in the fall, who had skipped his senior year of high school. At that point, USC started to get an embarrassment of riches. Did you ever ask Pete about having, he won most of his, he won his national titles when the roster really wasn't as saturated with NFL talent. And then when he saturated with NFL talent, there became this kind of issue of like, getting guys to play, satisfying people, resting on laurels and all that kind of thing. Did he ever kind of reflect on what is the right amount of talent to have to operate in the college game, or is there such a thing?
I mean, I think for that, I don't really know. I don't know if there's a magic formula for teams, but for that era, having those Hackett guys still around was the most important thing. Having people who could still feel, and this includes Ed Orgeron, who was also on the staff, who could still feel that pain, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many guys I talked to who said, you know, that feeling that pain and then having Pete come in and give us the chance to elevate and be excellent was like all we needed, right? And so I think, once this happens in all dynasties, it happened at the end of Saban's dynasty. These dynasties become sort of, they become decadent in a weird way, right? I mean, they get like kids come in, they're all five stars, they're swagging around, they put the helmet on and the shoulder pads on, and they have the Trojan on the side that
Sure.
people will just walk away, but they're not, because you're everybody's Super Bowl. From that point on, you're literally, people still storm the field. Vanderbilt stormed the field when they beat Alabama 2 years ago. I mean, it's
Right.
a big deal. So,
Yeah.
I think that, again, what Saban did, which was so sort of unnatural in a weird way, was to maintain a dynasty. We'd never really seen that before, right? To maintain it for a really, really long time. I mean, there's a chapter I have in the book. It's called, I mean, you can get to the mountaintop, right? But then how do you survive greatness? The chapter is called Surviving Greatness. And it's just one of the great I mean, Saban did it. So everybody says, well, it can be done, but he's a lot like Tiger Woods. Saban was like this unique individual that probably never will happen again. So, I think for these USC teams, having people that were still connected to that pain, and then you start to see it, after the 04 season, you start to see Orgeron's gone. You start to see there are not many, I don't think there are any players left from the Hackett era, stuff like that. And there's this sort of, the swagger doesn't have any foundation, right? This confidence doesn't have this, going back to this feel of the hurt.
Yeah. So Matt Leidert comes in, succeeds Carson Palmer, has a great first year as a sophomore, finishes sixth in the Heisman vote. The Trojans win the split national title. And again, in a way, when you talk about motivation, this seems to be like a big theme in the Pete Carroll era, which is like he needed a challenge to like give him the dopamine hit to really like overcome something to make it, to have success. Like he couldn't just win; he had to win a certain way, or he had to. It's like the person like when your big brother plays you left-handed kind of thing, and you know what I mean. So he needs that challenge. And he got a little lucky because in 2003, I mean, like, it's not really luck, but it was like, what do you call it? Silver lining. The Trojans get, in their mind, snubbed for the BCS. So now they've got this chip on their shoulder going into 2004. And they had the slogan "Leave no doubt," which is, something that guides them throughout the whole thing. And most of the time in sports, every team has like this slogan or some kind of chip on their shoulder. They create a chip on their shoulder, but there's a reason why people have these chips or create these chips or recognize them. It's because they are great motivators. So he had this natural built-in motivation going into 04, right?
Great motivators, especially if they're real. Like, those players were angry. They were, I mean, even though they had got a championship, they were really angry. I mean, they deserved to play LSU that year for sure. I mean, that would have been a great battle, I think. And that again, like they're still climbing the hill, even though they won. They're still, that hilltop is not ascended quite yet, right? I mean, they haven't reached. I mean, I think perfection might have come for them. I term it as the word made flesh in the book. Come probably in that Oklahoma game and the title game. I mean, they're just unstoppable at that point.
Yeah.
Like
that's the culmination of it all, right? The zenith.
Absolutely. And so, that was what they had been working for. And then again, just going back to what we were just talking about, I mean, okay, you got there, you're on the mountaintop. What are you gonna do now? How are you going to stay up there? Everybody's coming for you. Everybody's coming for you. And that's the moment when Pete decides to change it up. I mean, unintentionally, Orgeron leaves because he's got a new job, but, decides to break up the offensive triumvirate they had, right? To, basically tell Norm Chow to leave and put it in the hands of these two young guys, Kiffin and Sarkisian, who were, I don't know, at that point, late 20s, maybe,
mid to late 20s. Yeah. I guess it had to be a little bit bewildering to a few of like the veteran coaches, right? Like Orgeron and Chow, where it's like, hey, what are we doing here? We've got like this great thing going. we can be the future future Dick Sabans of this era, and let's just keep doing it. And he's like, no, no, let's try it this way. See if we can win it doing it this way.
I mean, you can see why he might be confident if he had Leinart coming back. Still
Yeah.
had Reggie and Lendell in the backfield, had a great wide receiver crew, had great people on defense. You could see why he would think that. But, I'm with you. I'm like, here's your chance to do something no one's ever done in the modern era, to win three in a row, and really solidify yourself as one of the great, if not the greatest dynasty ever. Right.
Yeah. You close the book on it.
Right. And instead you're like, let's throw a couple of, he can't do anything about it. Eddie's gone anyway. Right. But
Yeah.
I don't know. I did ask him, and he just demurred. He didn't answer. But like, do you wish you kind of had kept? He did say it, and I didn't. I said, do you wish you kept Norm Chow around? He wouldn't answer that question. But later on, I asked him another question, and he said, I made some mistakes with some assistants. And he was very candid about, not losing good assistants, but then not filling them with equal talent, equal or better talent, right?
Yeah.
Which again goes dynasties. Also, you watch this at the end of the Saban thing. You just can't hire good assistants anymore. It becomes harder and harder to hire good assistants as these dynasties go on. So,
that ascent, as you talk about, the 2002 to 2004 period, getting to the top. What was the most surprising thing that you learned talking to Pete? Maybe something you didn't know before, someone who watches college football or follows it, or what's something that maybe our listeners who don't really follow it might be surprised to learn about that era at USC?
Just the ascent era, or the 05?
Just the ascent period.
I mean, I go back to the we always talk about the coaches, and then the stars like that. But I go back to the ownership that people like Omar Nazel, like people who was a defensive lineman who didn't end up playing in the NFL, but the ownership that those guys took, right? And Omar didn't even like Pete, right? But he was like, these are my dogs, this is my team, I'm going to do this just almost to prove Pete wrong, right? So that to me was just fascinating to see there was this cohort of players who had been under Hackett and had really felt that pain, right? And used that as motivation. And even if they didn't like Pete because they didn't think liked him or whatever, or like them or whatever. And so, that was really, really, really fascinating. And this was also the beginning of when you had the celebrities start to kind of show up, and Will Ferrell shows up. And, one of my favorite anecdotes in the book is I think it's after an 04 practice, when there's, the guys are Matt Leinart, Jarrett, and all these guys are on billboards all over LA and stuff like that. Yeah. And I mean, they really have gotten this deluge of publicity at this point. Leinart's not quite as famous as he's going to be in 05, but he's getting there. And, Farrell asked Matt Leinart out for lunch after practice one day, and they're sitting there at lunch, and a student comes up and he goes, Mr. Leinart, can I have your autograph? Doesn't even look at Farrell. It's Matt Leinart's autograph and walks away. So, I mean, this is, there are tons of little stories in there that are fascinating to me.
To be fair, Farrell would come by practice and he would kind of look like a homeless guy half the time. Yeah, no. He was pretty scruffy.
Still, he was like, I mean, that old school was coming. That was right around. He was.
Oh man, the old school period. I remember taking the bus to the stadiums, and they would play old school in the bus. Little clips from it, and oh man, Pete just loved old school. He was rolling hard most of the time.
Hilarious movie. I mean, that's when Farrell's star took off too. So.
Yeah, they kind of Pete Carroll and Will Ferrell sort of had they were kind of joined at the hip during that period. Okay, so we go into 05, and then you get this. It's sort of like you get the flaming out of the comet, you get the supernova happening, and it's one of the most interesting seasons in college football history for sure. Not only for how it finished, but for, it had a lot of implications going on for the rest of college football going forward. I mean, you started to see the read option. You saw Vince Young doing the read option and rendering Pete Carroll's, 4-3 under defense. You start to see the cracks in that scheme, just the whole like focus on the celebrity of the team. Everything was just it was just a wild year, and something like you said, it was pre-social media as well. So like the heat that was generated from that year was like very authentic, because it wasn't like now you can just get a bunch of bots and create the impression of something, but then it was actually real engagement, online and in newspapers and with fans and fans chasing these guys in airports. And they still almost pulled it off. It's like the big question I always in my mind is, and I'll ask you this: did they underachieve that year, or did they overachieve that year, given everything?
Great question. I mean, I think given the fact that, again, they were on that mountaintop and how hard it is to stay up there, uh, they probably neither overachieved or underachieved. They probably did exactly what they were going to do. I mean, and then you look back at also these guys handling this fame, like at this point, Reggie Bush, particularly Matt Leinart, are Matt Leinart is becoming as famous at that time. He is as famous or more famous than some of the celebrities who were coming to watch them.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
not. I
He
went
was a
through
crossover guy.
I went through old People magazines, old Us Weeklies. TMZ had just started then.
Yep.
Lines about Matt Leinart was spotted with Paris Hilton at Nobu or whatever, right? I mean, it kind of crazy. Like he was, so he had reached this. So imagine doing that as a college kid and still, oh, we got to go play Oregon State, so that was a little bit tough. But I think the triumph in the Bush push game, when again everybody at that point is just, I mean, Charlie Weiss, who was the coach of Notre Dame at the time, the whole season pointed to that game, right? And they pulled out all the stops. They grew the grass 4 or 5 inches tall. The students, when the 2 buses came in for USC, they rocked the buses, threw bottles at the buses. They used to have their pep rallies in the basketball auditorium, moved it to the stadium, had Rudy there, had Joe Montana there, had a guy dressed like Jesus. I mean, they pulled out and then did the green jersey thing, of course, before the game. They literally pulled out all the stops and they darn near won the thing. So, I mean, you think about these these are really, I mean, after that Notre Dame game, Matt Leinart, who scored obviously on the Bush push, was the guy pushed in, was sitting in the locker room on the sidelines first, but in the locker room just weeping. And he wasn't crying because he was happy. It was like this, this is pressure, pressure to perform. And then, what was really interesting, I talked to a couple people who were there, and even Lane Kiffin kind of admitted this. Chow had this sort of, he wasn't conservative, but he loved to get kind of beat you death by 1,000 cuts. Here, 5-yard, 7-yard slant, whatever. Kiffin and Sarkisian were like little kids who got a sports car. I mean, they were like, go, and so it put a ton of pressure on Leinart and a ton of pressure on Reggie Bush, and just to put a ton of pressure on their stars there. So, and you add that onto the, just being the, the talk of the town of LA, but also the talk of the nation, really. I mean, you're in college football anyway. So I don't know. I find that to be just a really, really fascinating year. And I have spent a whole chapter on the Bush push thing because I thought it was so interesting, right? Just even the little breakdown of the actual drive going up to that. And Charlie, I got a great interview with Charlie Weiss, who, still complains about it a little bit, but was pretty wild about it. And actually brought his son into the locker room to show him kind of what a man does when they lose. His son, Charlie Weiss Jr., of course, Lane Kiffin's OC at Ole Miss, and now has moved over to LSU with him. So, the Texas game, I mean, they could have won that. They could have won. So in that way, maybe they did. That game had some bizarre, the Reggie Bush lateral in the first half. They had Reggie Bush not thrown that ill-advised lateral to poor Brad Walker, which was recovered by Texas. They might blow out Texas. I mean, they're on their way to blowing them out at that point. And once USC got that, the other team just kind of cried uncle, right?
Yeah.
And that was a huge turning point, a huge turning point. Even, in the fourth quarter when Jarrett caught the touchdown, put them up by 12 or whatever. I mean, it looked like it was over,
Yeah. A couple Texas defenders ran into each other. They were both lying crumpled on the turf, and it seemed symbolic for the game. It seemed like,
incredible visual
TKO, right?
Yep.
And you're right. And these things just come down to just these little things that could have gone one way or the other. And it's funny to think that someone like Pete Carroll it was that close to, like you talk about him being top 12, top 15 or whatever. He would have been
like a Rushmore
immortal, right?
Yeah,
in that regard.
He would have been a Mount Rushmore kind of candidate.
Yeah, exactly.
There are 2 other things in that game I want to point out too. There was a Vince Young played a nearly flawless game until the fourth quarter. He had one play when he got chased out of the pocket and did what you're definitely not supposed to do, what Brett Favre famously did in the playoffs. Threw off his back foot as he was falling down. And that ball just fluttered in the air. And there was this third string or second string, safety out there, Ting brother, who
Yeah.
just jumped up and batted it down, as opposed to if he catches that ball game, right? And then the Lendale White 4th and 2 play had been gaining an average of 8 yards in that game and all season, and it only gets a yard and a half on that play, which is just, just like, so it's little tiny, it must, Pat Rule was hilarious about it. He was like that play, he still tosses and turns at night. He was the offensive line. Still tosses and turns at night thinking about that play. And he said that's the play that drives him the craziest. And he was on the sidelines for the Seahawks Malcolm Butler play as well. So,
yeah. How about the Vince Young knee down on the lateral touchdown? I think that was because there was replay in that game.
They screwed it up.
The replay booth was was down during that play. I mean,
there's a shot there where because Fouts and Jackson are going nuts. The announcers were like, why wouldn't they do that? And they show a picture of the guys in the replay booth. And one guy's basically just like arms up, like, I don't know. But that play, so they would have they were on their way to scoring anyway. So that play to me was a little, who knows? Vince might have turned it over or whatever, but they were probably going to score in that drive anyway, So.
Yeah. And what did Pete say about, like, I mean, how that year ended up? Like, did he reflect on things he would have done differently, like in the micro sense of maybe of the year versus like the macro sense of hiring somebody?
Yeah, I mean, it was mainly about assistance. I felt like, it was like, he talked about those last two. So he basically called the defensive, calls, and he made the last 2 calls of the game were the exact same call on the defensive side. Worked on the 3rd down play, did not obviously work on the 4th down play. He was very reflective about that because that became the thing that, again, made it impossible to survive greatness. Losing that game, coming that close, right? And he had never talked about it before. I got him in a kind of reflective, many of the interviews we did, he was like in his fishing cabin in Washington State, like very, very unusually reflective and unusually kind of mellow and kind of sitting down and not like going around the place. So, but he was, he had one point where his voice cracked, almost like he was going to cry because you get that close, right?
Yeah.
And to a certain degree, that was the beginning of the end in a weird way. I mean, they had a shot in 06, they had a shot in 07, they had a great shot in 08, right? To do it all again. It's not that they weren't still great, they were. But I felt like Pete's mind started working again because they're off the mountaintop. They're all the way, his mind, they're all the way at the bottom again. So now they got to, so it was it was a devastating loss for him. Devastating.
There wasn't the same magic, I think, is what it was. I mean, and magic it's very, obviously it's an ephemeral thing, but like Matt Leinart had magic, right? He didn't have Carson Palmer's, physical tools, but he was a gamer. He was one of those guys that just somehow found a way to, get things done. And he did it at such a high level and so efficient. And it seems like a USC, the recruiting machine was so prolific that it was like machine-like, very similar to the Saban era, as you mentioned earlier. But like you said, what's that thing about having like so many quarterbacks? You don't have any quarterbacks. It was kind of like that with some of the positions during that period. Like they had 8 running backs.
Yeah, they had 12 running backs at one.
Not 12, yeah.
I mean, I think 10 of them were 5 stars and 2 of them were 4 stars. It was like, and it was ridiculous. And again, Pat Rule, who was a great interview for this book, because he was very candid about everything. It was like that was ridiculous. It's like you need a bell cow or 2, right? Said they were trying to feed all these guys so they wouldn't, so they would remain happy. Also, I think there's just like those that come in, they're 5 stars that come in USC. There's like I don't know, there's not a chip on their shoulder. Right. And there's not a chip on the shoulder of the guys who are still there because they're coming off winning. How do you can get a chip actually after the USC Texas game, but it's hard after 2 in a row. It's like, how do you develop that chip? And with Saban's genius, somehow he found a way to make the chip even bigger.
Well, he's just a maniac about it, right? He's just like, it's almost like Pete is a different kind of guy, right? He has other interests, or he has like, he's obviously all football, but he likes to play basketball. He likes music. He reads stuff. He thinks about, like, I don't know, maybe Saban does that. I don't know. In his spare time, I don't ever hear him talking about it other than, the basic coaching stuff. But it's funny to me that Pete isn't more influential as a coach in the sense that, like, clearly successful. But you mentioned earlier about that he's West Coast thing, but that's like just saying like, but there is this bias or is this prejudice, I guess, where it's like, but it's funny to me because usually results speak for themselves in sports. And so I'm just always wondering like why aren't people more people reading the inner game of tennis
Yeah, yeah.
or stuff like that?
I think he actually is more influential than we think because the game has shifted to what was when he did it was unconventional.
Hmm.
Now it's not that unconventional, right? I mean, you still have the archetype, the Saban Belichick archetype
Yeah.
and archetype, but you've got a lot more. Like players coach isn't the pejorative term it used to be, right?
Okay.
It's not at all. I mean, look at Mike Tomlin was a players coach, right? And having the coach is a interesting person is not. I don't know. I think Pete did, and sports psychology, massive thing like that. Everybody uses it now, right? Everybody, and if they're whether they're studying Galway in the inner game of tennis or not, they're still using some of those principles have seeped into the game. So I actually think he was massively. He was the first coach really to prove that it could work.
Great
Right?
point.
And he
Yeah.
did it at USC, and then he did it again and he did it in the pros as well. So I do think he had enormous amount of influence. We just don't put his name to it.
Yeah.
The camera is so funny. In rewatching these, we rewatched a ton of games for sometimes, from the beginning to the end. The camera cannot go away from Pete Carroll. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Like sometimes you don't even know who the opposing coach is, right? It's
Yeah.
always on. He's like an actor. He's
Oh yeah, he's got great command.
He's
Yeah, yeah.
fur in his brow. Like he's talking he goes over to the ref and he's talking a little smack with him, gives the ref a pat on the butt. I mean, it's like
Mhm.
he was a showman.
Oh yeah.
What he was, right? The
Yeah.
camera always found Nick Saban because he was always snarling and they wanted to catch him, grabbing the punter's face mask. But it captured Pete Carroll for a different reason, right?
Yeah.
Because he was just looked like it was fun,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, making it fun is another thing. That we're going back to what's kind of seeped in from Pete Carroll to this new era is that and I think especially you got to do it these days with the NIL stuff. I mean, you want these kids better have a good time or they're going to go somewhere else.
Yeah. Well, what is Pete's superpower?
It's a great question. I mean, I think it is making it fun. I think, I can't tell you how many players, and I'm not kidding. I would bet that it was somewhere between a dozen and 2 dozen players told me without me really asking, that what he did, and the coaches did this too, that what Pete did during those USC years was to make the game fun again. Like they had been through, it was fun when they first started playing shirts and skins in their backyard. Very fun.
Mm-hmm.
It was
Mm-hmm.
fun when they played in middle school. Starting to get a little less fun in high school and a lot less fun towards the end of their high school career, because these coaches were yelling at them and berating them and you got to do this, you got to do this. And all of a sudden they come to USC and here's a guy who's doing, pulling pranks, who's goofing off, who's trying to jump over the pile on fourth down and like no one catches him. And he tries to do like an Eddie Vedder and have the crowd catch him and no one catches him and he lands right on his back, And there was one guy, Marcel Allman, was like, he was so goofy. But when your coach is doing that and having fun, you can't help but have fun. So I think having that, so it was that, but also this ability to, he helped create the vibe, but the vibe kind of, was organically grown, right? Out of just winning personalities and kind of like that. For a long time, what he did during that, for most of his time there, he corralled that vibe and made it work for them and made it be their great superpower. I mean, I talked to a couple high school kids who would, on their high school recruiting visits would they'd just been to Alabama and they'd just been to Tennessee and they'd just been to Penn State and they come out to USC and Snoop Dogg comes over and gives them a high five and they're like, I'm going to USC, or they went out that night and went to all the great restaurants and all the great clubs or whatever. So, but another thing about Pete too is his use of psychology was, he always came across as the fun guy. But he was, Lendale White used to call him Sneaky Pete. It was always used for a reason. Like he wasn't just doing it to make it fun. It was fun with a reason. Like he would take you take the players, call off practice and take them to the beach to watch a beach volleyball, and then come back and start practicing again. And that seemed like it was fun, but it was more about like how do you change suddenly and refocus. It's all about refocusing. And so he was always, manipulating is kind of a strong word, but he was using that psychology to kind of get his philosophy across. So I think it's fun and the use of psychology really would be his superpowers, I think.
Yeah. And I think it was also refreshing to the national media, which was why, because he may have had his own shtick, may have had his own cliches, but they were new cliches, relatively new cliches on on the sports media landscape. So it wasn't like, when he had a halftime interview, he wasn't necessarily going to say the same things. He was just going to say it a different way, and it was going to be more fun.
Yeah. I mean, that energy, by the way, he's funny because you as a reporter, you feed off the energy of the person you're interviewing, right? I mean, and so we would sit down and have these interviews, and he would usually start kind of laid back and circumspect, but at some point he would jump up and his voice would go up and he would get really, and you can't help but get like a little bit, fired up about like with him, because he's just bringing this energy. And I loved, his halftime things are so funny because all the coaches, when they have to do those interviews at halftime, they're all saying the same crap. And he's always, hope you're having a good time. Go Trojans. He's like, and then sprints off. It's like,
hope you're having fun. I am. Yeah, it runs off. Yeah.
Just a complete character. So
one of a kind for sure. And this is a one of a kind book for those of you who are USC fans or college football fans or Heisman fans and want to really get a close up granular look at really important era in college football, the modern era, where I think, it's like this was the era that sort of set the stage for where we are now, for good or ill.
Mm-hmm.
So Monty Burke, thanks for coming on the Heisman Trophy podcast. Appreciate your sharing your views and your insights on one of the great coaches in college football history, coach of 3 Heisman winners, 3 in 4 years. I mean, imagine that. I mean, just that may never happen again. Just an insane accomplishment. And thanks for coming on, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me.